So this is Mariah, Kylie, Nicole, Amanda, and Cameron. Baroque composer Johann Sebastian Bach said, "It is easy to play any musical instrument. All you have to do is touch the right key at the right time, and the instrument will play itself." Now, obviously, we all know it is more difficult than this to play music and perform on an instrument. One of the most difficult aspects of learning to play an instrument and performing music is understanding the style of the piece that you're playing. One of the ways that we can learn how to play with the correct style is by studying the historical era that the piece we are playing comes from. One of the most distinct, important, and interesting eras of music is the Baroque era. I have played flute for 8 years, and I have studied and performed Baroque music extensively at the Schwob School of Music, where I am currently studying to be a performer and teacher of the flute. So after doing extensive research, I would like to inform you about the Baroque period of music. Today we will be discussing 3 aspects of this era: the prolific composers, musical elements that they used during this time, and the instruments that were used. First, let's talk about Baroque composers. We will begin our study by discussing 2 prolific Baroque composers. The first is Johann Sebastian Bach. According to Britannica.com, he was born in 1685. Bach was a master composer, and his accomplishments in music have been compared to Aristotle's accomplishments in philosophy and Leonardo da Vinci's accomplishments in art. This comparison was made by Kuhn, McIntyre, and Slominski, authors of Baker's Biographical Dictionary of Musicians. According to biography.com, Bach started out working at New Church in Arnstadt, Germany, then became the court organist for Duke Wilhelm Ernst, and then worked at St. Thomas Church. During all this time, he composed and performed a lot of the pieces that we still know and listen to this day. Some of Bach's most famous works include the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, the Mass in B minor, and the Brandenburg Concertos. Milner, author of the Bach-Johann Sebastian article in the New Catholic Encyclopedia, was quoted as saying that Bach was the most illustrious member of a family of successful musicians. The second composer we will be discussing is Antonio Vivaldi. According to biography.com, he was born in 1678. He was a virtuoso violinist, teacher, and composer who had many successful students. According to BaroqueMusic.org, Bach was born after Vivaldi, and so Bach actually adapted a lot of Vivaldi's works for different instruments and different instrument groups that he thought those pieces would sound better for. One of Vivaldi's most famous works is arguably the Four Seasons. This was where he took the 4 seasons, spring, summer, winter, and fall, and put them to music. So since it is summer now, let's listen to a short excerpt from Summer by Antonio Vivaldi. Now that we have discussed Baroque composers, let's move on to the musical elements of the Baroque period. Next, the musical elements that made the Baroque period distinct was firstly, basso continuo. This was a continuous bass line that was played throughout an entire piece with a melody on top. Basso continuo was normally played by a harpsichord or organ with a solo instrument on top. According to Baroque.org, composers focused more on a single voice melody with a simple accompaniment than they had focused on in other eras, making this a very distinct element of Baroque music. Another element used was contrast. According to Baroque.org, composers focused more on dynamics, so the louds or softs in the piece than they had in the past. Now that we understand the musical elements, let's talk about the instruments used during this time period. Thirdly, the Baroque era had distinct instruments. One of these important groups was strings, and more specifically, violin. In the article, The Baroque and Classical Revolutions in Western Music, authors Andre and Neal say that Bach used violin for his partitas in 1720. These same authors also state that Bach used violin for its virtuosic abilities, or the ability to play impressively and with great technical skill. One ensemble that was used during the Baroque period was the Baroque orchestra. Called a chamber orchestra for its small size, it included violins, violas, cellos, and double basses for the string section, recorders or wooden flutes, oboes, and bassoons for the woodwind section, trumpets and horns without valves for the brass section, timpani for the percussion section, and it also included harpsichord for the basso continuo section. These orchestras were different from the orchestras that we know today because they were, of course, smaller and they were using less modern instruments, typically made out of wood and called Baroque instruments. Another important group, according to BBC.com, was the basso continuo group of instruments. This was, as mentioned earlier, harpsichord, organ, with a solo instrument, which was typically flute, oboe, or a violin. Now that you know and understand three aspects of the Baroque era, let's sum it all up. In conclusion, the Baroque period lasted from around the year 1600 to around 1750, according to ClassicFM.com. This period involved many distinct composers, musical elements, and instruments that made the era different from the other musical eras, such as classical or the Romantic period. As you can see, Baroque music is not nearly as simple as Bach said it was to play an instrument. Even though it's hard to learn about these periods, it is worth it because music is an important art form. Always remember the popular quote and fun saying, "Without music, life would be flat."